Okay, thanks everybody for being here, and thanks so much Bonnie and the rest of the team for inviting me to give you a talk today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Bonnie described my intersections were digital humanities, digital studies, and post-colonial studies. I was originally trained as a post-colonialist. I just kind of did digital stuff on the side because I am geeky and liked it. And only after I really got my job did I start trying to combine both interests. And so one of the debates that has been going on in the field of digital humanities for some time is where is the role of race and ethnicity in the digital humanities? And when thinking about that question, I started thinking back about my training that I got in graduate school in post-colonial studies. Started thinking, okay, so if I wanted to think about integrating both of these things, how would I do that? What would a digital post-colonial studies look like? And so I decided to try to go for my inspiration to look at the people that the two people, I'm only talking about one really here, the two people that have really influenced me in terms of my ideas about colonialism and education. Fanon is one of them. So my life changed when I first read Fanon. And so instead of doing what would Jesus do, I'm doing a what would Fanon do. So it's it's purely speculative, but these are my ideas of if Fanon were alive today, and if he were as angry about colonialism as he was in the past, what would he do? What would he do with the new social media ecology that we currently have to change things? Or what wouldn't he do? So I wanted to ask, if Fanon had Facebook in the 1950s, what would he do about the teaching of about the impacts of colonialism? So when I'm talking about Facebook, I'm not just talking about Facebook itself, but I'm interested in a larger conceptualization of knowledge distribution in digital ecologies, meaning that I'm interested in talking about the social media landscape. I'm interested in talking about network knowledges. I'm interested in the community that we create when we talk to each other and get to know each other on the internet. I want to know what's going on when we create reality on the internet. So my talk today is going to be about, and some of you who are familiar with the work of Deleuze and Guattari might probably find this very familiar. I'm going to talk about digital knowledges and rhizomes, digital post-colonial knowledge, rhizomes, and algorithms. While there have been many studies of radical media forms utilized by decolonial activists in the form of print media, radio, television, and film, scholars still have yet to make progress in connecting the political use of digital media with the idea of radical media. So I'm sure that many of you have probably heard of discussions that, oh, Twitter activists are just slacktivists because you're just clicking like on Facebook doesn't make you an activist, right? Signing a change.org petition it's not quite the same thing as like chaining yourself to a tree, right? So there's all this critique of online activism as like not real activism. And whenever I speak to proponents of hashtag activism, for example, they always tell me about the longer struggles where in the 70s, people who tried to be activists, like calling people on the phone, were not called real activists because they weren't walking on the street. So you see, the thing is that we're always thinking about technology, the newest technology as not being representative of the real thing. But in other words, what I'm trying to talk about here is that a lot of people, we write off, a lot of academics write off hashtag activism or social media activism as clicktivism or slacktivism, arguing that social media, and this is from Malcolm Gladwell, only engenders weak ties rather than the strong ties that we really need to form robust political community. But the effectiveness of social media activism and the web is really undeniable. I mean, if you look at the impact of the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street movement, hashtag feminism on Twitter, such as Solidarity is for White Women, Not Your Asian Sidekick, Ferguson, the killing of Trayvon Martin, all of these events convene around community passions and angers around issues such as class exploitation, racism and white feminism, racism of law enforcement institutions. And without Twitter, without the impact of Twitter, these movements would not have such big effects. I mean, there's been a lot of studies on how Occupy Wall Street was really underreported in the mainstream media before Twitter made it such a thing. Similar things for Ferguson, similar things for the Baltimore riots recently. So my talk today, I'm going to argue that those of us who want to be and want to consider ourselves radical teachers should intervene in this discussion and engage with social media, because social media is currently the most influential public sphere that we have. This is, I think, a really important space to engage with. It's also a really, really scary space to engage with because it's so public. I'm going to talk today more about the positive possibilities of engaging with this space. And in the larger version of this paper, which is currently under review, I talk more about the negative issues. So I said that my talk was going to be based on my hero, Fanon. It's also based partially on my other hero, Freire, right? So as Paulo Freire says in the Pedagogy of Freedom, to teach is not to transfer knowledge, but to create the possibilities for the production or construction of knowledge. And increasingly, I argue this space of possibility of construction is on social media. So I argue especially that social media offers this possibility of creating knowledge or space for us to debate knowledge, not just in terms of allowing us to distribute content, but also in terms of creating new forms of knowledge structure. In other words, social media and network knowledge creates a rhizome for knowledge distribution, a structure which I consider politically radical. Developed by Deleuze and Guattari, the rhizome offers a polyvalent structure that was invented to counter the binary oppositions in Enlightenment thought. In today's talk, I will explain some of the significant features of digital network culture that can be put to radical teaching use. So in my longer version of the talk, like I said, I talk about the less utopian perspectives on social media. I talk more about the rhizomatic structure, and I also talk more about the pitfalls and negative parts of engaging on social media publicly. Sorry about that. It's not my computer. It's a service. I have one too. That's why I know I don't like it at all. Why are you not moving? My goodness. Technical difficulties. Man, if only I had a board. Okay. All right. Slide's not working. I'm just going to talk. All right. So what I was going to show you, but I can't show you now because I can't advance the slides, is a big triangle, right? And the big triangle is supposed to represent traditional print knowledge. So print knowledge is different than network knowledge because print knowledge is like a pyramid, right? Only because print is so expensive, only stuff that has passed through all these experts can actually be published. So in the model of print, you have all these experts. You have peer reviewers, you have professors, you have academics, you have professionals that judge whether something is good enough to be published or not, right? So that's the pyramid. On the other hand, I argue that digital knowledge is more like the rhizome. And again, I can't show you the rhizome. Sure. I'm just, sorry, I got distracted. You might not be able to go very far because it's connected.
Pretend I'm not here.
Ignore the Bonnie in the room. All right, so we have the pyramid, and I'm saying that in contrast to the pyramid being print knowledge, we move to the rhizome. And the rhizome is different because it's not just everything being filtered through a stable series of gatekeepers. The rhizomes have multiple points of entry, multiple points of exit. In other words, it's really chaotic. But it's also offers a lot more potential because there's so many possibilities of entry and so many possibilities of exit. So digital publication, we have no real need for experts. You don't need to go through your professor. You don't need to go through your peer review board in order to publish a blog post on WordPress. So on one hand, this seems as though for us who are brought up in the traditional system of knowledge, it seems horrible. It's like when you ask your students, it's like when you tell your students don't refer to Wikipedia, right? Don't refer to Wikipedia as like the ultimate source because there could be problems because any random person could edit Wikipedia. Well, any random person, as you well know, can publish something on the internet, right? So you can't trust stuff because it's on the internet. Well, the question is, could you really trust stuff to begin with? And that's something that I think Fanon would have really made clear, and I think that's something that post-colonial theorists really tried to make clear. Post-colonial theorists basically argued, starting with Edward Said, starting with people like B.Y. Mundumbe, who wrote about the image of Africa, basically wrote that the way in which we think about knowledge and the way we think about truth is Eurocentric. The way in which we think about truth has the idea of whiteness as a condition of normality and everything else as conditioned to be the other. So post-colonial theorists basically told us to begin with that print knowledge was problematic. And Said's book, Orientalism, was all about how print knowledge was problematic in the form of the Orientalist archive. So we have the pyramid, and then we have the rhizome, the chaotic, anarchic rhizome. On one hand, you have the pyramid where all knowledge is going through and filtered through this narrow little apex where you're supposed to have quality. And on the other hand, you have like any random person writing anything. What do you think the post-colonial theorists would prefer? My argument is that they would prefer the latter rather than the former. And the reason for that is because the rhizome goes against the idea of the neutral, depoliticized authority. So Said's foundational work with Orientalism has shown that the notion of expertise took shape within European thought to construct discourses of the other that were used to justify colonial expansion. And if you look at Orientalist scholarship, a lot of reasons for colonialism were built upon the idea of experts. It's sad. That's the funniest thing I've said so far.
Her slides are on SlideShare. I'll send you the link.
Okay.
No, the SlideShare slides are different.
Oh, okay.
No.
Sorry.
I don't show you on this one.
That's fine.
Close?
Yay. Thank you. Okay, now I'm all lost. Where am I? Rhizome. All right, so we start with this. Right?
Yeah,
We did that. I visually demonstrated, like, with interpretive dance, right? Thanks. I like you. All right, so you go from the pyramid to the rhizome, which is like a crazy network of people interacting with each other. In other words, you're creating public knowledge. And I argue that decentralized knowledge looks like that, pretty freaking chaotic, because it's not like everything is going through one central authority that tells us what is what, but rather it happens all over the place. It's conversations taking place with one another, rather than conversations being only directed one way. my argument is that if Fanon had Facebook, or if a lot of post-colonial or colonial, anti-colonial writers had Facebook, what would they do with it? So would they have told our students, okay, so think about this. If Fanon had Wikipedia, what would he do? What do you think he would do? I'm seriously asking for a response. Well, if Fanon had Wikipedia, do you think he would tell his students, don't check Wikipedia? On one hand, he would, but on the other hand, he would also say, don't go to the library. It's all racist, right? It's true. So, I mean, the problems with Wikipedia is that it's based on the library, right? But the issue with Wikipedia is that you can actually edit Wikipedia. So one of the projects that I work on, post-colonial digital humanities, we try to encourage is to edit Wikipedia in the classroom. It's something that another organization called FemTechNet, which is a radical feminist organization that's the anti-MOOC, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. What they try to do is also encourage feminist editing of Wikipedia as a research project, as a class project. So instead of having your students write the research paper that you really don't want to read, get them to contribute to adding better things to Wikipedia. So I think that Fanon would try to get his students to rewrite Wikipedia, and that's something that we should think about as radical teachers as well. Don't ask our students to simply be little repositories of knowledge that they will spit back to us, but ask our students to be co-authors of that knowledge by producing it for the world. So I've done this Wikipedia assignment in several of my classes, and I have to say that generally my students are, I have two reactions from my students. First reaction is, oh my God, I thought that Wikipedia was the devil. Like, why are you asking me to touch Wikipedia? And second of all, oh my God, I'm actually going to write something that some other people are going to read. Help, help, help. But this also means that my students are by far the most engaged and actually become the best at writing when they engage Wikipedia because they actually think that it matters, rather than the stuff that they're going to just write for their professor. So, some people think the rhizome is a bad idea. The rhizome is a bad idea because any random person, random white guy here, with a computer now has access to a soapbox and a megaphone, meaning that there's going to be a lot of mediocrity. You're going to have a lot of typos. Perish forbid the typos. There's going to be a lot of typos. There's going to be a lot of mediocrity. But most importantly, I think, for the post-colonial critic, for the radical teacher, digital publishing or engaging online really asks us to interrogate the idea of the unassailable, powerful expert. And that, I think, is the biggest potential of digital media. For instance, David Weinberger notes that as knowledge becomes networked, the smartest person isn't the person standing in front lecturing you. Get it? Get it? The smartest person in the room is the room itself. It is the network that joins the people in the room and the ideas in the room and connects to those outside of it. So his argument really isn't just saying that all of us, by all our powers combined, we are the smartest people in the room, but rather it's the network that connects all of us together and the network that connects everybody to outside. That makes us the smartest people in the room being the room. So it is the infrastructure that creates a form of communication, which in turn gives this knowledge its content by giving it its shape. Now, we all know that this is happening all around us. Knowledge, or the idea of the expert, is being challenged. And we see this, for example, in terms of journalism. Citizen journalism often offering more up-to-date, maybe more accurate versions of news than mainstream media. I got in trouble at an American Historical Association meeting earlier this year because I made the suggestion that why are historians so important when there are citizen historians around that are also writing and telling histories, and historians didn't like that apparently. But The whole point is that the concept of the expert and the concept of the unassailable expert, which in the form of the authority of the teacher, the professor, the Orientalist, is being challenged currently. Traditional journalists also report that their work is now instantly under scrutiny once published, and actually that leads to more corrections and retractions because of this scrutiny. We also see that a lot of mainstream journalists get taken in by hoaxes, like, for example, with Sandy, and we have sharks swimming in the metro and things like that. You have lots of fakes. People don't know whether they are fakes or not, including journalists writing about it. So journalists' authority and prestige for being the quickest source of news is being challenged by citizen journalism. The immense array of news covered by citizen journalists and social media users reveals the narrowness of the spectrum of news reported by traditional media outlets. And you see this, of course, with the underreporting of a lot of events, such as Occupy Wall Street, with underreporting of Ferguson, underreporting of the recent Baltimore riots. So another important structural shift that I've talked about so far, that I will talk about next. So I've talked about how the content of knowledge changes, and the structure of knowledge. This is also due to the structure changing. And another important structural shift that I want to talk about next is the production of knowledge now doesn't just take place in individual private silos, but rather in public. So if you're having a conversation on social media about an article, for example, in the past, it would be me and Bonnie and two other people sitting in a room, and I would give her my article, and I'll ask her, what do you think? And we'll have an exchange of ideas. And then I would go back, get your revisions, and I would get your suggestions, revise everything, publish my article, and it seems as though my article has just like sprung from me. Like it's all produced by me, this solitary genius, slaving away in a garret. Actually, it wasn't, because all work had to go through some kind of collaborative peer review before it gets published. So what work on social media or doing your research on social media does is to make that peer review process more transparent, because you're writing in public. And there are a number of people who actually try to make this really clear, such as Michelle Moravec, who has a Writing in Public project, and a lot of experiments in the digital humanities where they make peer review more open by asking people to have their books reviewed online by anyone before they actually get formally published. And you can see this with Kathleen Fitzpatrick's planned obsolescence and several other experiments which I've raised down here. Okay. So again, I argue the network structure potentially mirrors the form of the rhizome. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari proposed the model of the rhizome as an alternative structure, not simply for post-colonial knowledge, but alternative structure against the entire Enlightenment. As an alternative structure for the binary dialectical thinking that has been the foundation for Enlightenment thought. The rhizome model is an effort to think beyond the concept of a dichotomy, the thought of a strictly dichotomous linear ordered structure, and starting my quote here, any point of a rhizome can be connected to anything other and must be. The linguistic tree on the Chomsky model still begins at a point S and proceeds by dichotomy. In contrast, not every train in a rhizome is necessarily linked to a linguistic feature. Semiotic chains of every nature are connected to very diverse modes of coding that bring into play not only different regimes of signs, but also states of things of differing status. So the idea of the rhizome is really interesting because it really goes against the foundation of Enlightenment thinking, in particular the Hegelian mode of sublation of knowledges. And it's interesting that this has so much relevance to the digital form of knowledge, because when 1,000 Plateaus was first published in 1980, their central object of criticism was the print book. So the print book for Deleuze and Guattari represented the tyrannical structure of the Hegelian dialectic. So this is a quote from them. There is no longer a tripartite division between a field of reality, the world, and a field of representation, the book, and a field of subjectivity, the author. Rather, an assemblage establishes connections between certain multiplicities drawn from each of these orders so that a book has no sequel, nor the world as its object, nor one or several authors as its subject. So in this argument, Deleuze and Guattari criticized the pyramid-like structure of print knowledge, their conceptions of assemblage and connections between certain multiplicities actually anticipates the hyperlinked nature of the digital world where multiple types of knowledge can simultaneously exist and be interconnected. So if I go back to Fanon, I think that he would find post-colonial knowledge through the network public sphere as really encouraging because of its rhizomatic nature. Digital ecologies provide tremendous opportunities for radical and structures aiming to reveal the ideological leanings and biases of ideas associated with knowledge production. Through the ease of access to production, digital media makes it possible to highlight and make legible the experiences and narratives of subaltern subjects. In this matter, the structure of the ecology of digital knowledge, which prioritizes the crowd rather than giving control over to a small group of experts, is rhizomatic. It bases its main creative spark and reason for being on the people who create it. It's also rhizomatic, as I've said before, because of the multiple points of entry, exit, and connection. And rhizomes, in other words, mirror the Wild West of the internet, indicating the diverse potential of social thought, as well as its limitations associated with the idea of a fact. For every website that uses a fact to support its message, there exists a completely different website that marshals different facts for the same cause. So unlike the linear totalizing order of print, the ecology of digital publishing is anarchic and I think in a liberating sense. In the longer version of the paper, I talk about some of the less utopian developments in network knowledge. In particular, I examine the concept and ubiquity of the algorithm and the gatekeeping this sort of knowledge suggests. So finally, so what if Fanon had Facebook? What would Fanon do? What would Fanon do? I think, for one, he would be tremendously excited by a great deal of the political potential of the web, given the many ways it can be used to destabilize colonial objectivity and authority. In his attempt to find new inventions, Fanon's work anticipates the rhizomatic structure later elucidated by Deleuze and Guattari. The open web, one in which access to publication is quick and easy with minimal cost and setup, is one which offers radical teachers and activists tremendous potential and possibility. But as I go on to explore in the longer version of this article, Fanon would have also cautioned the growing use of proprietary algorithms in determining the information that people see. In other words, why don't you see everything that is on your friend's Facebook feed? Because of algorithms. And algorithms are starting to determine our knowledge. Algorithms also are responsible for what comes out on Google searches. Very disturbing because I started getting a lot into like making skincare products. Total diversion, right? So like I'm looking at how, and I'll Google how to buy beeswax from which big box store sells beeswax, and and constantly I'm getting on Google autocomplete, I'm getting things like how to buy guns from big box stores, or how to buy bullets from big box stores, and I'm like, what is going on? Why is everything about firearms and bullets and guns, and I'm just trying to buy beeswax? But that also tells you the algorithms are created by the people who search for them, also telling us about the nature of the people that are using the internet and constructing the internet through these algorithms. So I would argue that Fanon would have cautioned the use of proprietary algorithms. He would have argued to open up the algorithm for people to inspect and contribute to. He would also have encouraged radical teachers, especially with a post-colonial bent, to emphasize and utilize the rhizomatic structures of the digital world as a means of pushing the limits of colonial hierarchies and its orders of knowledge, while at the same time cautioning against the technical gatekeeping elements such as algorithms and data gathering surveillance. Much of anti-colonial and post-colonial criticism has been dedicated to unpacking and complicating the ways in which dominant ideological discourses encourage forms of social alienation. We need to move the social space from which we fight this battle from print to the network public sphere.
That was the most wonderfully gracious managing of, okay, my slides have completely borked, and I'll just continue making visual images for you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, the piece, I'd love to open this to questions. We have about 20 minutes before the next session, so I'd like, if we can have about 10 minutes for questions. I know that with this audience, we've got people who work with rhizomes, with all kinds of some of these ideas in educational spaces. So what kinds of comments and questions would we like to open? Oh, Lord, please somebody besides Dave raise their hand. No one is going to save me from this. We might get back to you, Dave. Sorry.
Over there, there are questions over there.
There's a gentleman right in front of Dave, and there's someone right here. Okay. You can tweet here.
Okay.
You can tweet. I like that.
Thanks very much for the talk. It was provocative in many ways. I want to ask about the idea of the expert, right, which you kind of characterized as, on one hand, there's the unassailable expert, right, and on the other hand, there's the wisdom of the crowd.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't there some in-between space, right? So the experts don't have to be unassailable. In fact, that's sort of how academic expertise works most of the time, right? Is that and to sort of extend that out. Knowledge can always be provisional, right, without sort of appealing to the rhizome in particular ways. So I just wondered if you had some thoughts on, you know, if there's a space in between the wisdom of the crowd and the unassailable expert.
The first thing I would say in response to that is that I don't necessarily think that the crowd is any smarter or any wiser than the expert. I mean, all you need to do is to look at Reddit as a really good example, right? I'm not saying that the wisdom of the crowd is better than the expert and the expert is unassailable, but rather I want to shift the discussion to the way in which we consider how knowledge gets made, right? Outside the academy, we have the preconception that knowledge has to be vetted by experts in order to be true. Within the academy, we have the idea that all knowledge is constructed, and there are going to be lots of people arguing about what this knowledge actually is. But that's not really what we teach to undergraduates in higher education. We don't tell them, oh, look, this concept is under dispute. We're like, learn the concept, and then you can dispute it later. And a lot of undergraduates finish university and then go out and say, okay, well, this is correct or not correct because it was vetted by experts. So I'm not saying that the expert to begin with is not assailable. I want us to shift in the way in which we think about how knowledge becomes produced and how what knowledge becomes considered to be good knowledge and what knowledge is considered to be not so good knowledge. I mean, there's an interesting thing because Paulo Freire actually writes about exactly that. Like a teacher should get used to never being right. Or a teacher, the problem with teachers is that they always want to be right. But there's no such thing as being right because right is always shifting and is always contingent. And what we need to get used to is the idea of being contingently right and looking at all these different perspectives. And I think the rhizome here offers you the perspective of looking at this shift. So I'm not necessarily saying that it's one versus the other. The reason why I'm proposing the pyramid to the rhizome is because I think the structure allows for more possibility, rather than saying that one is definitely better than the other.
Thank you. Kate, and then Thanks so much for your remarks. I have a question coming from outside the United States. And what often seems to us the unproblematic assumption that the networked public sphere is not merely an amplification of new forms of colonization, particularly in relation to the non-English speaking internet. How do we get past this? How do we have a new conversation that moves beyond the tendency to normalize the United States itself in these networks?
That's a really fantastic question. And if I could answer that with a really pat answer, I would probably be a lot more famous than I am now. I'm saying that you're right. Like, for example, one really good way of thinking about the hegemony of the United States on the internet is the fact that there is no .country name after that. It's always .com, .net, whereas I'm from Singapore, right? So everything is .sg after that. In Australia is .au after that. So that's where, in the States, nothing is marked. It's only if you're from not the States that it's marked. Or maybe Canada. Canada, you're not marked either, are you? Oh, you're totally marked.
We're sorry you haven't heard of us.
Sorry. Speaking from the hegemonic perspective here. I don't have any easy answers for you other than to say that you are right and that we need to constantly be reminded about these things, about the Anglocentrism of the internet, about the US-focused dominance of the internet, and the fact that computing languages are also heavily reliant on, what is the word? The alphabetic system. So not just the alphabet, but also English. Like majority of programming languages, there are a few attempts to design programming languages that are not using English as a base, but majority of programming languages are in English, right? And I see this also, this is a big problem within digital humanities conferences, because when you say that, oh, this is supposed to be work that's open to everybody, but you still submit in the original language, which has to be in English, what happens when people are producing really good scholarship, but their first language is not English? And how do you recognize that this is good scholarship? So I don't have an easy answer for you other than to say that's a fantastic question, and we need to constantly be reminded of that.
So the gentleman in the back, and then Dave. I'm feeling pressured.
I appreciate your good humor, and I expect everyone does in responding to the questions. In particular, the question, the defense of tyrannical expertise, of course, I think was timely because and I welcomed the fact that you backed away from the simple binary that represented. I'm wondering if you'd also withdraw the tone with which you presented the image of the middle-aged white guy with the tie. It felt like a family photo to me. And I wonder if maybe at another point you'd find a different. He looked like a postal worker also. I don't know which was, but I wonder if you'd also sort of maybe establish some distance yourself between that. But I want to raise another point. It's the way you invoke evidence from the world of scholarly communications and publishing. The truth is the Shakespeare Quarterly experiment turned out to be a dismal failure. By their own account, it didn't work. And if you look at Kathleen Fitzpatrick's planned obsolescence, the often cited as the great example of the community of knowledge working together, the vast majority of comments in the comment press version, if you count them, are from friends of hers. Very little showed up from outsiders. And if you look at the Public Library of Science, which by all accounts is the best experiment we have in open review, you could look for days before you find a comment on any of the journal articles here. The only point I'm making is that these are truly experiments right now. And it's hard to cite them as examples for rhizomatic knowledge, when in fact, for better or worse, the habits of most scholars and scientists are running in a different direction. So I wonder, where else can we look in the world of scholarly communication, scientific and scholarly communications, for maybe better evidence for the kind of point you're making?
Okay, so there are two questions here. The first one I didn't quite understand when you're asking me to move away from an argument about the random white guy.
That was a poorly stated joke, that's all.
Oh, so it wasn't a question. It was a joke. Right.
Okay.
The second, because I really didn't quite understand what you meant, but the second one that you're talking about is that you are asking me, you're saying that the examples that I cite aren't a really good argument for rhizomatic knowledge.
Right.
And I don't know whether they're not a good example simply because they've failed. I totally agree that they've failed. And they've failed for many, many reasons. They fail because of, in the humanities especially, how we determine credit. How we determine credit is when you are a single author on something. So for example, if you're really busy, you're not going to have time to trawl the internet and just leave comments on somebody's work, especially sustained comments. Whereas if a press asks you to review a book, and they give you honorarium for reviewing a book, and you can then write on your resume that you're reviewing for this press, then it gives you much more reason to do it. Yes, status, reason to do it. However, I don't necessarily know that that is not a good idea, that makes the argument that rhizomatic structures do not work. It simply means that rhizomatic structures in these instances have not been successful, and it also tells you a lot about the problem of looking at single authorship, the problem about looking at how we value the idea of the expert within academy itself. So I'm not simply saying that this is a problem that has to do with publishing. It also has a problem that has to do with our entire institution of knowledge, of education.
I think there are some other examples that even people in this room can speak to where there have been some successful growing areas for that. And with that, we have one.
Speaking for the Rhizome,
Woo!
yeah, I'd like to ask a question specifically about Fanon and how he would feel about the Rhizome. I found in my own work with trying to take this approach that it can be a very kind of decentralizing process, right? And that's its intent. So the idea, in order to allow the Rhizome to grow, you yourself have to get much, much quieter. Fanon's work is about being really trying to drive people towards new realizations.
Yep.
And I wonder about what you, I mean, obviously we're speculating, we're doing the what would Jesus do stuff, but give me a what would Fanon do. How would Fanon balance the power that the Rhizome has to replicate itself with the need to actually integrate into that process enough to be able to give people different perspectives on what they're doing? Because that's the challenge with the rhizomatic approach, right, is that if you just let it go, it just goes, and you have no idea where it's going to go, because it just does crazy things you don't expect. Lots of crazy things you don't expect. So how do you think he would handle that challenge of being quiet on something that he wants to be really, really loud about?
Remember how I had this slide up where you had a network where everything was focused on one node, and then you had a different network where different communities are clustered around multiple nodes, right? So I think that recognizing the rhizome is more of like that than everything clustering around that one node. Yeah, but that is the way things are. And what I would say is that, you know, it's really interesting when you started talking, because Fanon actually is recognized by most people who work on postcolonial studies as passé because they consider him so binary and dialectical in thinking. And I argue actually that he's not binary and dialectical in thinking, that it's a matter of perspective. So I think that you can be really convinced of wanting to be right, and like Paulo Freire, to understand that you are also going to be an emotional being, and that's conditioned by your experiences and affected by your experiences, and your knowledge is therefore partial, just like everybody's knowledge is partial. You can be a really good advocate for your partiality of knowledge and still understand your partiality of knowledge.
But how do you promote that inside? I mean, print is a shouting activity, right? If you print something, you've shouted it, right? You've had the chance to say the same thing for 300 pages and make a very coherent, deep, profound article.
If people read it.
If people read it, which we'll
All
accept that
300
Fanon people have, and we're talking about what he would do.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Rhizome, you only get little specks of time to speak. And the more you speak, if you control it, you go back to hub and spoke, right? You go all the way back over to hub and spoke. So you have to, in order to promote the lines of flight, you have to let it go.
Yeah.
And then it's going to tend to replicate the existing structures rather than change.
Would it?
It seems to, in my case, 7 years of watching it. It seems to.
I mean,
you have to intervene at some point, and I'm just wondering about the balance of that.
I'm thinking in relation to hashtag activism. Has it gone back to replicating the original structures of things?
Those
Black Lives Matter.
But those are not.
I knew it. We have to move on. Thank you so much.
Sorry, to be continued.
Thank you, Adeline, so much. Really, really appreciate it.